In this episode, I'm going to show how to take a photo that looks like this and turn it into something that looks like this. And along the way through this tutorial, I'm going to show a variety of different Photoshop techniques that you can apply to just about any type of real estate exterior photo to make them pop. What I've done for this example, like I've done for just about everything that I shoot outside, is I always shoot in a bracket. And what I've done here, and I've labeled them too so that we can keep track of them, I've got the medium exposure, I've got then one stop difference to give me that darker exposure, and then I've got another stop that goes brighter for the brighter exposure. And you can see that there's enough pieces here to use to blend this together. Since I've got this bright exposure which can handle the inside of this overhang, I've got then the dark exposure for the sky that's up here, and then I've got the medium exposure which should work very well then for everything else we've got for the exterior. Now blending those together through HDR, you tend to get a muddy mess. You don't need to do that. I don't recommend using HDR for this. It's simple enough using some standard exposure blending methods. Now we're going to use a variety of different ones here because this is very tough because we have three different areas that aren't your typical exposure blending areas. A lot of stuff going on with some very bright stuff down here in the pool that we've got here. We've got then some very shadowy stuff up here, a different type of sky that we've got here. So we want to be able to do this selectively. That's why I'm going to show a variety of tools here along the way. And by the way, for the settings that I'm using, typically for the outside on something like this, I'm using ISO 200, and my middle exposure for the medium exposure is 2/50th of a second, 1/250th of a second at f8. And then I just go up one, that's 500th of a second, down one, 1/25th of a second. Some of this too will be covered throughout my real estate photography series. I have a link to that down in the description for this video. But when it comes to the exposure blending and being more complex here, if I were to take a standard exterior like this, it would be very easy. It's very easy in that I would take just the quick selection tool. I would make the quick selection tool very large, and I would just select the front of the house. That's my lower exposure, and I would just select that whole thing. Then I would just add a layer mask to it, and then we're done. So I've got this bright exposure that's over top of the darker exposure, and it's blended together, and that would get us all that we'd need. But this more complex example goes far beyond that using the quick selection tool. There's many other tools that we might want to use here, so I want to show a variety of them. So first thing, let's do something with the sky, and you'll see why we'll do that first. So let's move that dark exposure up to the top, and we can see now that there is some sky starting to show through. We can pump that up if we want to, but it's much better than just the medium exposure. So that's a much more appropriate exposure for that, but there's a lot of cutouts here. Some of it's also bleeding onto the wood. So what I recommend is first, let's put a layer mask on this. I like to do this from the menus. There's a lot of ways to do this, but I like to go up to the layer menu and then go down to layer mask, and then we'll just hide all. Now, I don't want to worry about the medium exposure right now because the bright exposure is what's going to be used for this covering that we have here that's covering the pool. So with only having that bright exposure visible, select that, and we're going to do a little bit of special luminosity masking. To do this, what I'm going to do is select the color range. And to do that, and we're going to do some other luminosity masking using some other techniques for some other areas, but up here, select a color range. Now in here, when you select color range to get some type of a mask that you want, it isn't really necessarily luminance based for the luminosity mask, it is color based. I could obviously from here select highlights if I want to, but I'll be able to do the sampled colors very well. So in here I would select one of those colors, and you can see I'm selecting it. It looks okay there, but it's so hard to tell on this little view. So instead, down here where it says selection preview, select that and use grayscale. Now we can really see what is selected. So now we can change the fuzziness slider to get the amount of blending that we want. If I go up really high, then you can see I'm bleeding onto the wood quite a bit. So I only want to bleed onto the wood a little bit, especially since I'm going to be showing some other techniques to take care of any overbleed that we get on there. So right about there looks about fine. Once we have that, we just select OK. Now you can see that selected, but it's selected a lot of other stuff. So what I want to do is go up to the layer mask on that dark exposure and select a brush tool. Now for right now, I'll change that flow so that the flow is 100% up here. Then what I can do is with a decent sized brush overlapping onto the wood, I can tap in where I want that. Now, you can try to hit delete, you can do other methods to take an all-encompassing grab of that, but I do like to use the brush in a lot of cases because it gives me a lot more control. Now, you can see that it didn't really select the trees, so let's unselect that by doing Control D. And you can see that it also overlapped a little bit. We're going to take care of all that. First thing you can do is you can always try Quick Selection Tool. So up here, just the standard Quick Selection Tool. With that, you can go in here and try to select in around some of this area, like where the trees were and whatnot. You might draw a polygon. Take a brush, use a smaller flow. Like up here, we'll use about 30% flow. And then overlapping onto some of the wood, try to brush some of that in. You can do the same thing over here too. We'll use that Quick Selection Tool, grab that, and then brush some of that in. Now, instead of using the Quick Selection Tool for the whole thing, and instead using that color range to try to get a mask, we get a better determination of edges that way. Since it wasn't able though to get into these colors or the difference in luminance, then we had a little bit of an issue, and that's where this secondary issue comes in, the secondary technique. Now, we still have some overlapping stuff on here, so let's go in here. We're at about 100% right now. We can see that there's a little bit too much. Even when we add in a little bit of our medium exposure, which we will do later to kind of blend this a little bit, still a little bit too much. So, you want to get rid of some of that? On the mask, take an eraser. Take your flow so that your flow is about 100%. Take the eraser size and move it down so that it's just reaching the edge of where we want. See, it's about the width of this wood. I'll lower it just a little bit. And by the way, to change your size on eraser and brush, just use the square bracket keys on your keyboard. The left square bracket will reduce the size, while the right square bracket increases the size. That makes this go very quick. Anyways, let's get right close to the edge here, and all you do is you first, with the eraser tool, do a click. Move it down then to where you want and do a shift click. And what that does, it erased along a better line. You can see this is where it was, and then doing that. So let's do that over here, for instance, on a couple other areas like right here. So what we'll do is the same thing here. We'll go up to the edge here with this size, and we'll just do a click. We'll go down here to near the bottom, we'll do a shift click, and the same thing maybe for some of these other areas, like about there, do a shift click down to there. You can see now that we've got a lot of that erased, so that's good, and we'll refine some of this a little bit later. Let's zoom back out, see where we are. So now we have that dark exposure put in there fairly well using that technique. Let's turn our medium exposure back on. We can see that if we wanted to, we'll blend that. We'll do that later. Right now what we want to do is now add that bright exposure. So let's move the bright exposure underneath of the dark exposure above the medium exposure. And you can see this is why I wanted to do the sky first, because I don't have to worry about trying to get the bright exposure around the sky. It's underneath of whatever we've picked for that dark exposure, in this case the sky. Now, similar to what I showed for the standard everyday type of exterior where you use the Quick Selection Tool, we're going to start with that for this big patio overhang. So let's zoom out just a little bit so we can see what's going on with the tool. First thing I want to do is just hide everything. So I'll just go Layer, Mask, and then Hide All. Then I'll take the Quick Selection Tool. Once again, this is just like doing it before. We're going to show some other tools here coming up. A trick to using the Quick Selection Tool is that for areas like this, it has AI built into it for edge detection. And the edge detection, like other types of edge detection for sharpness algorithms and whatnot, is looking at contrast. So that's why the shadows will get picked up, but you want to take your Quick Selection Tool to the edge. You don't want to use some small Quick Selection Tool and try to drag it around. You want something that's very big to the area that you're trying to get. Go near the center, and you can see I'm up against near the edge there of that overhang, and click. And then you can do that in other areas. You can see how it better picks that up. Now, I'm not worried about the sky here, so I'm going to quick select all around there. That's good. So with that selected, what we need to do with the mask all selected on the bright exposure, reverse our colors by pressing X. That changes our colors to black and white instead of white and black. Now we can just press the delete key. You can see that now is showing through, unaffected by the way from the dark exposure since it was underneath of it. Now we still have these pillars and some other areas. So a couple things we can do here. Let's go in here a little closer. I can use the quick selection tool on a pillar like this. Let's just say that I did, but you can see what's happening. It's overlapping here. So you can take the quick selection tool and hold down the Alt key, which changes it to a minus. It's a subtraction up here. So if I hold down the Alt key and do quick selection, it deselects that particular area. Since we already have our colors at black and white, just press delete. Now we can do some other type of quick selection here. And you can see that a little bit probably was missed over on this overhang here. And we can fix that enough, and we'll fix that just by going up here with a polygon tool. So I can just take the polygon and just maybe extend that across here, since this beam is probably pretty flat. Go across there, and once again, boom, that's taken care of. Now, for the trickier part, look at these pillars here. This one here might be better selected instead of using the quick selection tool that's standard, which probably would work, but there's a lot of tones here that are very close in contrast, so it's inevitably going to overlap. For instance, if I select that, you can see that sure enough, it went out into the grass and over here, so let's deselect that. Instead, what we should do here is to use the object selection tool. So using that, and we'll use the rectangle out of it, draw a rectangle around that pillar. Once it's selected, since you have your colors already reversed at black and white, just press delete on your keyboard. Now, the rest of this, we'll go ahead and use the standard quick selection tool. Pick it back up again here. And we'll go in and pick up some of these shadows here, go up on this pillar, and yeah, some of it overlaps, so we'll do our Alt quick select to take care of that. Press delete, and then also down here, if we zoom out, to get all this other shadow area that's down here. So we can select that, and then maybe select this shadow area. It's really good, once again, at finding contrast. Now, we still have this whole pool, but it's so different in the types of tones and the brightness. So the best way to do this is first select the whole thing with a polygon. We'll just draw a rough polygon kind of around here. That's fine. Now that we've got that, press delete on your keyboard, and now that's in there, but it's too much. So first we'll do, take a simple eraser, use about a 30% flow up here, and then just erase some of that where you know that it needs to be erased. So make sure at this point your colors are white and black as you're using a standard eraser in standard mode. So that's looking pretty good, except for this area down here in the pool. And now we'll see what's going on here. We don't want that much brightness from this layer. And you could try to quick select it, you could try to erase it, but there's a much better way. Select the layer, and this is where we're going to do another type of luminosity masking. Go to channels. Do Control-click on the RGB channel, and you can see it's selected then a bunch of stuff, and that is 50% luminance. In other words, where the highlights are. We want to refine that a little bit more, so you do Control, Alt, Shift, and click on that RGB layer, and you see it starts narrowing it down. We'll do that one more time, which is Control, Alt, Shift, click. Now you can see we've got a nice luminosity mask, and it's a mask based off luminance. Go back here to layers, and then over here, we can now erase from that area. Use an eraser with about a 30% flow, we can decide to erase, and it's protecting then the other areas that don't match that luminance. So that looks pretty good there. So this was with and without it, and this is then with that in there. So you can see we've got pretty good blending going on. Now, once again, we wanted to blend a little bit more here. It looks a little unnatural, shouldn't really be that bright where all that sun's coming in, but that's because we use this whole brightness layer up there. So let's just erase a little bit out of that. So we can erase out of this a couple different ways. One, you can erase right on the mask, but if you really like this, you can place this in a group and add a layer mask on that. So all we'll do here is select that layer, say group from layers, and we'll call this the bright group. Then on that, we can add a layer mask, and we'll reveal all. Then on here, we can decide how much we want to erase. So I'll go up here and just erase some of that brightness around some of this wood. So you can see that now is looking a little more natural there. So this was without that, and this is with it. So you can decide then with this without having then to affect anything else with the luminosity around here, none of the other blending that was on our layer, because you have a separate mask compared to what you originally blended. So this gives you extensive flexibility on how much blending you want to do. Now it's time to really start pumping this up. We've got something that's pretty good, so we started out with this, and this is where we are by doing this exposure blending. So different things we could do. One, we could take this dark exposure and we could add adjustment layers on top of it to really pump it up. For instance, let's take a levels layer. Let's go to Layer, Adjustment Layer, and a Levels layer. And with this levels layer, right on top of the dark exposure, click this little icon down here, and that adds a clipping mask, meaning that it will only affect the layer directly below it, in this case, dark exposure. Now what we can do is really start pumping up some of the darks, so we can bring that left slider over to the right a little bit. Also the middle slider, you can play with that, bringing it over. You can see now we're really starting to pump up that sky. So this is with that levels layer, this is without it. Too much? Well, change the opacity. Maybe we'll change that down to about 70% to just have that much in there. Now we want to bring out more shadows in here. It's still quite shadowy, so there's another trick that I use for that. Go to the very top layer and do this keystroke. Do Control, Alt, Shift, E. And what that does is make one layer off of everything. You can see that if we only have that layer on, it's everything. Shut it off, there's nothing underneath of it. So now we can just work with this one layer. Now, what I'd like to do with this, I'll just duplicate that, and then I'm going to take it into Camera Raw Filter. So we'll go to Filter and then Camera Raw Filter. Doing this, you're able to do something far beyond what Lightroom would do, because I can do multiple things with this after making adjustments. Watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take the shadows and move them all the way up 100%. Now that looks awful right now. Let's just click OK, but let's not keep all those shadows. Let's go Layer, Mask Reveal All, and then let's take an eraser at about a 30% flow. And with that eraser then we can start erasing where things were already bright. We don't care about the shadows where it's bright, and that's what gives HDR its unnatural look, because it tries to then do all this compensation across the board for every pixel. You don't need to. So definitely erase the shadows where it's already bright, and that way you'll have better shadows coming through. So this is with our extra shadows added before we even do our post-processing presets. And this is what it looked like before. So a little bit more pumped up in those shadows. Now, you could flatten this, save it as a Photoshop file, take it into Lightroom, but I'm going to show one more thing. I'm going to do this in Photoshop itself. What we're going to do is that same keystroke again at the very top where we go Control, Alt, Shift, E. Now I've got one layer of everything that I can apply, basically the same settings from Lightroom, but we're going to use Camera Raw Filter. So once again, go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. Now in this case, you can see, like I did before, I've got this in full screen mode. That's what this little thing here is. So that if you're working in full screen mode, you get a lot better view of it, even more so than what you would out of Lightroom. But there's a lot of flexibility, because as you work with an individual layer in Camera Raw Filter in Photoshop, then you can adjust, erase, do whatever you need to, compared to things that you would do in Lightroom. You're very much limited in comparison. So anyways, let's go over here under the presets. It'd be a preset, the same ones that would be over in Lightroom, and let's apply this one here to get started with. That's my exterior 5K, and this is where it started. So let's change that. If you've upped your shadows like I was doing before, you definitely want to now lower your highlights more than normal, and also your blacks. That will give you a lot more contrast. A little much too much on the whites right here, and also it was just a little bit on the warm side, so let's just drop that down to maybe about -3. Also get rid of some of those reds, drop that down to about -2. Now some of these colors are muted because it was a semi-overcast day. So for muted colors, you want to be able to up your vibrance. Now you can pause it here if you want to copy down these settings. That'd be typical of what I do for a lot of exteriors. But in this case, I want to increase the vibrance just a tad more. And what that does then is it increased, and it doesn't need to go very much, that increased then the muted colors. Now, at this point you might be worried about, oh, you increased the shadows so much, and Nathan, you increased the shadows here. Well, you can always decrease them a little bit, but let's go ahead and say okay on this. And then let's go in 100% and take a look. So let's zoom in here at 100% and take a look and see if we can find any grain. So no, we see that it's nice and sharp. We see that the contrast is good. Even up here in the wood, there is no noise. And the reason being is because most cameras today are ISO invariant. When you're shooting at even ISO 200, you've got a lot of flexibility with RAW files and even the TIFFs that then would come over into Photoshop from Lightroom. So this was using just a Nikon Z5 24 megapixel sensor, and it wasn't some high-end Z9 to be able to do this. You'd be surprised how much you can push it. But anyways, let's take a look at where we started. Originally, we did have this, and then when we added all of exposure blending, then we had something that looked pretty good. It looked like this. Once we added some more shadows into it, then we did this, and when we added our final bump, we had this.